morning. Today I'm going to deal with the motor systems. This will be the last lecture in the neuroanatomy part of this block, but this is not the last lecture on the block. We're having two more lectures on the endocrine system. So the motor system today's lecture will be the last lecture in the nervous system, which we started at the beginning of this block. And we have already studied the sensory systems, the general sensations and the special sensations. And here in the motor system, there are actually two motor systems. There is the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. So I will start with the somatic nervous system. And here there are somatic motor pathways. And these somatic motor pathways, they control body movements by controlling the skeletal muscles, while the autonomic nervous system controls the cardiac muscle and the smooth muscles. But the somatic nervous system, soma means body, so it controls body movements, and these are controlled by the skeletal muscles. Here, like in the sensory system, which we have seen that there are multiple pathways in the sensory system. So here again, in the motor system, there are two pathways. In fact, it's a direct pathway, which is called the pyramidal pathway, and an indirect pathway, which is called extrapyramidal pathway. So I will start with the direct pathway. The direct pathway is called pyramidal pathway because part of this pathway passes through the medulla oblongata. Remember the gross anatomy of the medulla oblongata? It has the pyramids. These pyramids, which are located anteriorly, they are called pyramids because they look like pyramids, and so they contain fibers. These fibers, they belong to that pathway, which is a somatic motor pathway, and that's why the entire pathway was called the pyramidal pathway. And it is responsible for initiating and control of precise movement. This pathway starts at the primary motor area, which is located in the cerebral cortex. This area, which is in the precentral gyrus and the frontal lobe of the brain. The other pathway is the other somatic motor pathway are indirect pathways, and as I said, they are called extrapyramidal pathways. They do not have the same pathway, or they do not pass through the pyramid, so they are extrapyramidal pathway, and they include a lot of structures which we have studied now, like the basal nuclei, the caudate nucleus, the putamen, globus pallidus. Remember, we studied those with the brain, with the anatomy of the brain. And also it includes the cerebellum. And this indirect pathway is responsible for integration of motor activity, for automatic movements, control of muscle tone, and the cerebellum is for posture and balance. So in contrast to the pyramidal pathway, which initiates and controls precise movement, here the indirect pathway is more for coordination and muscle tone rather than the precise motor activity. That's why lesions affecting them will result in different consequences, as we will see in a moment. So let's start with the details of the motor pathway. Again, I would like to remind you that the motor pathways are either somatic or autonomic. The somatic are for the skeletal muscle, the autonomic are for the smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. I will start with the motor pathways, the somatic motor pathways. These are two pathways, the direct one, the pyramidal, and the indirect extrapyramidal. This one is the direct motor pathway or motor somatic pathway. It starts in the primary motor cortex, which is located in the precentral gyrus of the temporal lobe of the brain. And these neurons that are located here are called upper motor neurons. You will see here that this pathway contains two neurons. One of them is located in the cerebral cortex, and the other one is located in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. So this one in the anterior horn of the spinal cord is called lower motor neuron, while the one here is called the upper motor neurons. These neurons, they are multipolar neurons. They have dendrites, multiple dendrites, but a single very long axon, as you will see here. The axons of these neurons, they will collect together and descend down. As they reach close to the diencephalon, they will form a bundle, which is called the internal capsule. So part of the pathway passes through the internal capsule. This is a bundle of white matter consisting of axons of upper motor neurons. Okay? And then it will leave the cerebrum and will go into the brainstem. So it passes through the cerebral peduncle of the midbrain. Remember, this is a cross-section of the midbrain. It has cerebral peduncle, it has here the substantia nigra, here's the cerebral aqueduct. We have studied these anatomical details before, and posteriorly are the colliculi. Now these fibers, these white fibers, as they pass from the internal capsule, they will reach the cerebral peduncle, and then they will go through the pons, which is the middle part of the brainstem, and then down they will reach the medulla oblongata, where they are going to occupy the pyramids. That's why the pathway is called the pyramidal pathway. And then in the lower part of the medulla, before the fibers reach the spinal cord, and this is very important here, is that most of them, almost 90% of them, they cross to the other side. So they cross, this is called decussation of the pyramid, of the pyramidal pathway. So they decussate here, decussation, and they cross to the other side and descend in the white matter of the spinal cord. They will descend in the lateral column, lateral white column. Remember, in the spinal cord, there is an anterior white column, lateral white column, and posterior white column. And these fibers will descend in the lateral white column, and they constitute what is called the lateral corticospinal tract. The name indicates the location, it indicates the extent as well. Lateral, because it is located in the lateral part of the spinal cord, in the white matter of the spinal cord on the lateral side. Corticospinal, because it started at the cortex, at the cerebral cortex, and is going to go down into this, or terminate on the spinal cord cells. So the uncrossed fibers here, as I said, 90% cross. The 10% that do not cross, they will continue in another tract on the anterior white column, which is called the anterior corticospinal tract. But ultimately, even these fibers, the 10% that did not cross in the medulla, they have to cross before terminating on anterior horn cells, before terminating in lower motor neuron. And by this way, all the motor fibers arising from the cortex, they have to cross, and that's how one side of the brain controls the other side of the body. Most of the motor fibers cross in the medulla. The fibers that do not cross in the medulla, which are the minority, they cross in the spinal cord. And these fibers, both of them, they will terminate, they will synapse with motor neurons which are located here. This is called the anterior horn, or the ventral horn of the spinal cord. And these are the lower motor neurons, the anterior horn cells. The second neuron in this pathway, the lower motor neuron. So we have upper motor neuron here, lower motor neuron here, and these lower motor neurons are controlled by upper motor neurons on the contralateral side of the body because of the crossing. Again, these lower motor neurons, they are multipolar neurons. They have multiple short dendrites and a long axon. The axons of these lower motor neurons collect together, and they will constitute, or they will form, the anterior or ventral root of a spinal nerve. We have studied that before, how these fibers, they form the anterior root or ventral root of the spinal nerve, and that's why the anterior root of the spinal nerve is purely motor, while the posterior root here which is distended by the ganglion, dorsal root ganglion, is sensory. And the dorsal root and ventral root, they will meet and will form the spinal nerve. That's why the spinal nerve is mixed, contains sensory and motor fibers. But the roots, they are either sensory or motor. So the axons of these anterior horn cells, lower motor neurons, will form the ventral root of the spinal nerve. And of course, they are going to terminate on skeletal muscles at a neuromuscular junction. We have studied neuromuscular junctions with the muscular system. Okay? Here you can see the lateral corticospinal tract and the anterior corticospinal tract. The lateral corticospinal tract consists of crossed fibers, crossed motor fibers, descending fibers. Crossing took place in the medulla. Okay? Here, these fibers, they consist of uncrossed fibers, but these fibers, they have to cross to the other side before they synapse with anterior horn cells. And by this way, the entire tract is crossed. This is the location of the precentral gyrus here. That's the primary motor area, the red one, area number 4. And it is located in the frontal lobe. Remember, the central sulcus separates between frontal and parietal lobes. In front of it is the precentral gyrus, which is motor, and behind it is the postcentral gyrus, which is the primary sensory area, which we have talked about last time. So it controls voluntary contraction of skeletal muscles on the other side. Again, like the sensory systems, the representation, what we call it, the somatotopic representation here, the representation in the cerebral cortex reflects the importance of the part and not the size of the part of the body. So, for example, here, the muscles that produce skillful or very delicate movements, like the muscles of the tongue when you are talking, swallowing, muscles of the pharynx and the larynx. These are very important muscles, and they produce delicate functions, rather than, for example, in contrast, for example, to the muscles of the back or the gluteal muscles, which are bulky muscles and they do not produce these delicate functions. Similarly to these muscles that move to the eyeball are also very delicate. The muscles for the skillful movements of the hand are very delicate. So that's why you can see here that there's a very wide area here representing the hand. And there's a very wide area representing the face, the mouth, pharynx and larynx, in comparison to a smaller area representing the trunk and the lower limb, because these movements are not that skillful. So here there's a somatotopic representation, and the body is represented as an inverted, we call it inverted homunculus, like a midget, which is inverted upside down. Okay? And as I said, that more cortical area is needed if the number of motor units in a muscle is high. A motor unit, I think we mentioned that with the skeletal muscles before, a motor unit is the number of muscle fibers supplied by a single nerve, a single axon. Okay? So if the muscle is a delicate muscle, then it will have multiple motor units. The motor unit will be very small and multiple. So one nerve supply one muscle fiber, so that the muscle will be very delicate. But if the muscle is not is not needed for delicate movement, the muscle, especially the anti-gravity muscles, for example, that maintain the posture, then one axon might supply a large number of muscle fibers. Okay, so they are large motor units. So more cortical area is needed if the number of motor units in a muscle is high. Now what happens here, if this pathway is affected, paralysis will take place. And there are two types of paralysis that can take place, either affecting the upper motor neurons, for example, a cerebrovascular accident. I'm just adding this slide. It's not present in your presentation, so I mean it's just for an application. You are not required to differentiate between upper and lower motor neuron lesions, so don't worry about that. Okay, so if this pathway is affected, this will result in paralysis, because this pathway is responsible for initiating muscle activity. And so if it's affected, then the muscle will be paralyzed. And this effect could either affect the upper motor neurons here, for example, cerebrovascular accident, and result in upper motor neuron lesion, or it could affect the lower motor neurons, which are present in the spinal cord. Like, for example, certain types of spinal cord injury, or a viral infection, poliomyelitis, which results in paralysis, affects lower motor neuron and results in what we call lower motor neuron lesion. In the upper motor neuron lesion, the paralysis is spastic. There is increased tone of muscle, but in the lower motor neuron lesion, the paralysis is flaccid. The muscles are flabby and they will become atrophied soon. Now, the indirect pathways, I was talking about the direct motor pathways. The indirect pathways, it's not like upper and lower motor neuron. It is complex, polysynaptic. Multiple structures are involved, multiple neurons are involved. It's not like upper and lower motor neuron like in the direct pathways. So we have the basal nuclei, the cerebellum, the thalamus can also be involved, the cerebral cortex is also involved. This is just to remind you about the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei, they consist of the caudate nucleus. We have studied that before. Caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. The paler part of these basal nuclei, it is pale and called pallidus, which means pale because it has an increased amount of myelinated axons. Now, these basal nuclei, they help to program automatic movements like swinging of the arms and during walking, and also they control the tone of muscles. And that's why here, when there's damage of this extrapyramidal system, you will not expect to find paralysis like the way that you find it in the direct systems. Here, damage is characterized by like twitching or tremor because of loss of coordination, loss of muscle tone, but not paralysis. This is again the basal ganglia or basal nuclei. Basal nuclei and nucleus here, I would like to remind you again, it's a collection of nerve cell bodies in the white matter of the cerebrum. So that, and it's because it's located close to the base of the brain, they are called the basal nuclei. Putamen, globus pallidus, and the caudate nucleus, the nucleus with the tail. That's why they call it the caudate nucleus. And these basal nuclei are connected to the, for example, here they are connected to the brainstem, to the midbrain, substantia nigra. Remember the dark area, the black area which is located in the brainstem, the substantia nigra, because it contains melanin-like pigment. These neurons in the substantia nigra are connected to the basal nuclei, and its involvement of these neurons in the substantia nigra and involvement of the neurons or this pathway that extends from the substantia nigra to the basal nuclei, that results in Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease, which is characterized by rigidity, tremors, but not paralysis. Cerebellum is also involved here, and the cerebellum is concerned with motor learning. It controls the learned motor activities. like for example when you play tennis and then you get the skill of the playing tennis, like swimming and the coordination of the movements of your limbs during swimming. So it's concerned more with motor learning and coordination of these skilled movements, as well as its other function, which we mentioned before, which is related to posture and equilibrium. And again, this I think has been repeated as well, that the cerebellum is connected to the brainstem by 3 cerebellar peduncles. Each peduncle consists of a bunch of axons or white matter that connects the cerebellum to the brainstem. We have the inferior cerebellar peduncle, which connects the cerebellum to the medulla oblongata, and the fibers here either come from the spinal cord or from the olivary nuclei, which are present in the pons and in the medulla oblongata. And then we have the middle cerebellar peduncle. This connects it to the pons. That's why it gives the shape of the pons, the shape of a bridge, and that's the origin of the name pons, means bridge. So it connects it to the pons, the middle cerebellar peduncle, and these fibers are originating in the motor cortex, in the cerebral cortex, and they go down to the pontine nuclei and then project from the pontine nuclei to the cerebellum through the middle cerebellar peduncle. So the pons, so the cerebellum therefore is receiving fibers from the cerebral cortex through the thalamus, is receiving fibers from the medulla and from the spinal cord, and then it projects fibers through the superior cerebellar peduncle, which connects the cerebellum to the midbrain. And these fibers, again, they will project to the thalamus and to the cerebral cortex. So you find here that the pathways here are more complex. It's not like upper and lower motor neuron lesion, not one-to-one connections like we have seen in the direct pathways. So therefore, because of this complex pathway and the indirect system, the lower motor neurons, which are located in the spinal cord, they will receive signals from direct and indirect motor neurons, and some of these signals are excitatory, some of them are inhibitory. Remember the neuronal circuits which we introduced in the first lecture? It's almost the same here. It's a neuronal circuit that will result in the control of skeletal muscles. So here the skeletal muscles are involved. I was talking about the somatic nervous system, somatic motor nervous system. The motor system is somatic and autonomic. We are now done with the somatic, with its direct and indirect pathways. Now I will deal with the autonomic part of the motor pathways, the autonomic nervous system. So this, as the name indicates, autonomic, the autonomic nervous system, it is not under voluntary control, so it is automatic, autonomic, and it regulates the smooth muscle activity and cardiac muscle fibers. It doesn't affect skeletal muscle fibers like the somatic nervous system, and as I said, it is involuntary control. Here, this system involves part of it is located in the central nervous system, and the other part is located in the peripheral nervous system. Remember these two structural components of the nervous system, which we mentioned probably in the first lecture. Central nervous system consisting of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system consisting of the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. So the autonomic nervous system is rather a functional part that is located in both central and peripheral nervous system. The part of the central, the part of the autonomic nervous system, or the neurons of the autonomic nervous system that are located in the central nervous system are called preganglionic neurons, and the neurons that are located in the peripheral nervous system are called postganglionic neurons. Because here, unlike the somatic nervous system, there are two neurons involved between the central nervous system and the effector organ. You can see here the comparison between the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. In the upper part of the diagram here, this is the somatic nervous system. You have a lower motor neuron here in the anterior horn cells. Its axon will pass through the anterior root of the spinal nerve and reaches the muscle. So it's only one neuron involved here between the central nervous system and the effector organ. But if you compare this with the autonomic nervous system, you will find that there are two neurons involved in this pathway. One neuron is located in the central nervous system, in the spinal cord. In this case, it is located in the spinal cord, and its axon again leaves it through the anterior root of the spinal nerve, and then through the spinal nerve, and then there is another neuron which is located peripherally. And these neurons, which are located outside the central nervous system, cell bodies located outside the central nervous system, are referred to as ganglia. So a ganglion is a collection of neurons outside the central nervous system. That's why this neuron here in the central nervous system is preganglionic. And within the ganglion, it synapses with the cell body of the postganglionic neuron. And then the postganglionic neuron has its axon that reaches the effector organ. And the effector organ here could be a smooth muscle, like for example in the urinary bladder, or cardiac muscle, or it could be a gland. Okay? So here we have two neurons between the central nervous system and the effector organ, but in the somatic nervous system, it's only one neuron is working. Physiologically speaking, the neurotransmitter is also different. You can see here at the neuromuscular junction in the somatic nervous system, and we have studied that before, it's acetylcholine, but in the autonomic nervous system, acetylcholine is present in the preganglionic, it's present in the ganglion between the preganglionic and the postganglionic neuron. But close to the effector organ, it is not always acetylcholine. It could be noradrenaline or norepinephrine here. So norepinephrine is involved in the postganglionic neuron, in contrast to the acetylcholine of the somatic motor neuron. So this is again to show you the differences between the somatic and autonomic nervous system. Structurally speaking, there is one neuron in the somatic. Here there is two neurons, preganglionic and postganglionic neuron. Again, the autonomic nervous system is divided into two parts. It is parasympathetic and sympathetic, and many organs in the body, they have dual innervation, but not all organs in the body that have the dual innervation. By dual innervation, I mean that the organ is supplied by sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers. An example here, for example, the heart. Usually the actions of these two systems are the opposite to each other. So for example, if we take the heart as an example, the sympathetic nervous system increases the heart rate and the force of contraction, while the parasympathetic nervous system decreases the heart rate and the force of contraction. So we have two major divisions of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. The location of these, their connections with the central nervous system is also different. So we have the sympathetic nervous system. The preganglionic neurons are located in the spinal cord in the region between T1, first thoracic spinal cord segment, to L2, second lumbar spinal cord segment. Remember the segments of the spinal cord. So the location of preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system are only located here. That's why this system is sometimes referred to as the thoracolumbar part, because it arises from thoracic and upper lumbar segments of the spinal cord. While the parasympathetic nervous system, it either arises proximally from the brain, okay, or it arises distally from the sacral segments of the spinal cord, from segments S2, 3, and 4 of the spinal cord, or from the brain, and will be distributed with some cranial nerves. Actually, it will be distributed with 4 cranial nerves. That's why the parasympathetic nervous system is referred to as the cranial, because it arises inside the cranium, sacral component. So craniosacral, and in the middle is the thoracolumbar component. The craniosacral component is parasympathetic, and the middle one, which is continuous, thoracolumbar, is the sympathetic component of the autonomic nervous system. Okay? Okay. So, just a reminder here, the autonomic nervous system, there are 2 neurons between the central nervous system and the effector organ. This one is the preganglionic neuron, and the other one is the postganglionic neuron. We talk about, if we deal with the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neuron, the cell body of the preganglionic neuron, is located in the gray matter of the spinal cord in this region, the region which is called the lateral horn. It's a very small, tiny horn. If you compare it with the dorsal horn and ventral horn, this lateral horn is a small, tiny horn of the spinal cord. And it is not present throughout the spinal cord. It's only limited, its presence is limited to the thoracic and upper lumbar segments of the spinal cord, because this is the outflow. This is the region where the sympathetic nervous system is connected. So you will not, if you take a section in the spinal cord in the cervical region, you will not see a lateral horn, because there is no outflow of sympathetic nerve fibers from the cervical region. The same thing is true with the lower lumbar or with the sacral region of the spinal cord. So the preganglionic neuron of the sympathetic nervous system is located here. Of the somatic nervous system, the lower motor neurons are located in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. And the posterior horn of the spinal cord is mainly sensory. It contains sensory neurons. So sensory, motor, and this one is the autonomic, the lateral horn of the spinal cord. Fibers of these neurons will leave with the anterior root of the spinal nerve, with the ventral root, and then they will leave the spinal nerve. They will leave the spinal nerve for a moment, and will go to the sympathetic trunk. I will not go into details of the sympathetic trunk, but the sympathetic trunk is a long nerve trunk that is present on either side of the vertebral column. Outside the vertebral column, on either side of the vertebral column, it's a long nerve that is beaded, distended by ganglia. Okay? So in the sympathetic trunk, the preganglionic fibers will synapse, and postganglionic fibers will be distributed. They will be returned back to the spinal nerve and will be distributed to the skin to supply the erector pylorum, the sweaty glands, the blood vessels, smooth muscles of the blood vessels. Some of these preganglionic neurons or preganglionic fibers will not synapse in the prevertebral ganglia, but will synapse in other ganglia which are located in front of the vertebral column, they are called prevertebral ganglia. Prevertebral ganglia. The paravertebral are located in the sympathetic trunk. Para means on either side of the vertebral column, but the prevertebral ganglia are located in the front of the vertebral column. So, again, I don't want to go into details. There are ganglia, collection of nerve cell bodies outside the central nervous system. Sympathetic ganglia, these are either on either side of the vertebral column in the sympathetic trunk, or in front of the vertebral column, prevertebral ganglia. postganglionic fibers from these ganglia will be distributed to the effector organs, whether smooth muscles or cardiac muscle or glands. The same thing is true for the parasympathetic nervous system. So the cell bodies, the preganglionic neurons, are either located in the brainstem, and the fibers will be distributed with the forecranial nerves, or they are located in the spinal cord, but not in the lateral horn. There's no lateral horn here. They are located in S2, 3, and 4 segments of the spinal cord, and they will leave the central nervous system and will reach the effector organ, where their ganglia are located within the wall of the effector organs. It's unlike the sympathetic nervous system. In the sympathetic nervous system, the ganglia are located away from the effector organ. They are located either in front of the vertebral column or on either side of the vertebral column, pre or paravertebral ganglia, which means that the postganglionic nerve fiber is long. But here, if you compare it to the parasympathetic, see here, the ganglia are located in the wall of the urinary bladder. So the postganglionic neuron or the postganglionic nerve fiber will be very short. They are not located in ganglia away from the effector organ. As I said, that most of the body organs, they receive dual innervation, sympathetic and parasympathetic, and it's the hypothalamus. Remember, the hypothalamus has a lot of functions, including the control of the autonomic activity in the body. So the hypothalamus will regulate the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic activity. Some organs, as I said, they only have one innervation, only sympathetic innervation, like the sweaty glands, adrenal medulla, erector, pylorus muscle, and many of the blood vessels. But others, they have dual innervation, like the heart, like the smooth muscles that are present in the bronchial tree. So we have some of them, they cause dilation, others cause constriction, bronchoconstriction. Remember the smooth muscle fibers that are present in the pupil? We have the sphincter pupillae and the dilator pupillae, so they have, again, dual innervation. The dilator pupillae muscles, they are supplied by sympathetic nervous system, while the sphincter pupillae, they are supplied by the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic system, when there is dominance of the sympathetic system, this takes place by physical or emotional stress. We call them Esituations, starting with the letter E. So you have emergency, embarrassment, excitement, and exercise, and this will result in alarm reaction, a reaction which usually we term as fight or flight, in contrast to the reaction of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest and digest. This is fight or flight when there is predominant activity of the sympathetic nervous system. So you will have dilated pupil because of the effect of the dilator pupillae muscle. There is increase in heart rate and force of contraction. The logic of this reaction is that to prepare the body for fight or flight. So it has to prepare the energy and the resources for the muscles in order to provide more energy to the muscle. So you need to pump more blood into the muscle. So that's why there's increased heart rate, increased force of contraction. There will be decreased blood flow to non-essential organs. Like at that time, when you are, let's say, in an emergency situation, you don't need much blood vessels to supply the gastrointestinal tract. You don't need much blood vessels to supply your skin. So that's why these blood vessels that in the gastrointestinal tract or in the skin, they will undergo vasoconstriction. So when you are embarrassed or when you are in an emergency situation, when you are afraid, you will have pallor. Okay. because of the reduced blood flow to the skin. And you need to pump more blood into the muscle, so the blood vessels in the muscle and the blood vessels in the wall of the heart, the coronary circulation, which we are going to study later on in block 3, they will become dilated. So some of the blood vessels are constricted, some of the blood vessels will be dilated, and this is in order to provide more blood to the important structures at that time, the time of fight or flight, which is the skeletal muscle. Airway will dilate so that more oxygen will reach the blood, okay, because you need oxygen at that time. So the bronchodilators here, they cause bronchodilation. The sympathetic response results in bronchodilation. Blood glucose level also increases by the effect on the liver and the effect on the adipose tissue. Usually these sympathetic responses are long-lasting because it's not only the neurotransmitter that is released at the postganglionic end, but the same neurotransmitter, the noradrenaline, is also secreted by the adrenal medulla. We are going to study the adrenal medulla and the adrenal gland in the coming 2 lectures with the gland, with the endocrine system, and we will deal with more details about that. So that's why it is long-standing, because it's not easily removed. It's not. First of all, it is not easily removed from the synaptic gap. It's unlike the acetylcholine. Acetylcholine can be easily removed, but the norepinephrine is not easily removed, and norepinephrine is also secreted into the blood, so it has long-lasting effect. It is secreted by the adrenal medulla. We will talk about this later on, and you will see that the adrenal medulla is in fact containing cells of the adrenal medulla. They are much like postganglionic neurons, but they do not secrete into a synaptic gap, they secrete into the blood. The parasympathetic responses, as I said, they enhance the rest and digest activities, and so they help to conserve and restore body energy during times of rest, and usually they dominate over the sympathetic impulses. They include the responses here, they call them the SLUD responses, like salivation, lacrimation, urination, digestion. So like the parasympathetic fibers that supply the gut, they will cause more peristalsis, and they will cause secretion of glands from the gut. We will study that later on when we deal with the gastrointestinal system in block 3. And so there will be more digestion. Defecation can take place because of the increased peristaltic activity. So all these will increase. What's going to decrease is the heart rate and the diameter of the airways. Remember, the heart rate increases by sympathetic activity. The diameter of the airways increases again by sympathetic activity, but decreases by parasympathetic activity. And the diameter of the pupil, it will be a narrow pupil when there is parasympathetic predominance. Okay, any questions? Okay, thank you.